Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to Westminster's corridors of power. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll, in Brussels, but still thinking about what's happening in the UK.
Absolutely. The EU elections, of course. This is the first one without Britain, Stephen. Remember Nigel Farage's key role in the last vote that the UK was involved in? That was in 2019 for the Brexit Party back then. He trounced the Tories. They came in fifth, caused the downfall of a Tory leader, Theresa May. I mean, so many parallels and kind of developments in these political stories in the last few years.
Yeah, indeed. Look, I mean, think about what has changed, first of all. Nigel Farage's, of course, key mantra as a member of the European Parliament was trying to get the UK out. Pretty much all of the other parties that he used to pal around with in Brussels have dropped that as a campaign promise, as a goal of their platform. But then if you look at the group that Nigel Farage was a part of, that's one of the big winners of this election. People are still voting for those parties that Nigel Farage used to sit with in the European Parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other comparison also, and the other shock flowing from the EU parliamentary elections, is the decision by Emmanuel Macron to call a domestic poll, the French president, a snap election, also to combat a party further to his right, that is Marine Le Pen's party, also framing the election around national security. I mean, there again, the parallels to UK politics, to Rishi Sunak. Just have a little listen to Emmanuel Macron saying that the upcoming National Assembly election is a chance to determine France's future.
This is a serious and weighty decision, but above all, it is an act of trust. Confidence in you, my dear compatriots, in the ability of the French people to make the just choice for themselves and for future generations.
So that was Emmanuel Macron making a national address announcing that election. Perhaps Rishi Sunak might have preferred to do that and do it, well, A, indoors, but B, without any questions from anyone around him, and simply make that national statement to announce his election. Of course, Emmanuel Macron's doing this safe in the knowledge that his job as president is safe. And what he's essentially doing is opening the doors to let the National Rally, the far-right party, in to govern, if that's what the electorate chooses, of course, and then see what voters think of how it works out. But he's doing it in the way that the French system allows him to create the wonderful system of cohabitation, where you would have a president from one party, a prime minister from the other. The president still holds the power, but it does serve to perhaps weaken his adversaries in next election. Perhaps something that Rishi Sunak wishes he had the chance of being able to do.
Well, maybe. But then again, from the UK and the British perspective, one might say also sort of playing with fire in a way. He's trying to lay a trap, isn't he, for Marine Le Pen and her party, that if they govern for a couple of years, that they will do it badly, that they'll win the election and then they'll do it badly. But that perhaps is a big gamble, you know, if you think about David Cameron and the Brexit vote in and of itself. But anyway,
Caroline, do you remember the simpler times of earlier on in this election campaign where we talked about Rishi Sunak making a gamble that could pay off? That sounds very similar to some of the things that we were hearing about Emmanuel Macron. Some people saying that it was, audacious and bold that he was going for this election. Now others saying that it was a terrible risk. I wonder where we'll be a couple of weeks into the campaign and whether people will be saying similar things as to what they're saying in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, on the EU elections themselves, though, Stephen, you've been there, for a number of days now covering the vote, the build up to it and the results. You've spoken to loads of people very kind of close to the centre of power in Brussels. How is the EU dealing with the far right? And also, how would you characterise how big a win actually the far right got in the polls? Because I think that's a really important point to understand.
Well, look, they have more seats in Parliament now, still to work out exactly how they're going to organise themselves, because the far right are in two different camps in the European Parliament and they don't like each other, and there's some question about who's going to switch allegiances within the grouping, so there's still that to be worked out here. But actually, overall, the interesting picture is that the centre held in this election, and even though there was an increase in representation of the far right, the Greens did really badly. They were the big winners last time around in 2019, but actually the centre-right, centre-left and centrist parties, who had been, I suppose, the equivalent of a governing coalition in the last European Parliament, held on, and they're still in a majority in Parliament too. So perhaps showing that there is an increased interest from voters in the European Parliament, and actually looking at the post-vote poll that was done in France in terms of why people voted, it was immigration that was the most important issue after purchasing power, cost of living. Those were the key issues that were raised by voters when asked about why they voted the way they did. And those are things that sound very familiar on the other side of the English Channel.
Yeah, absolutely. Inflation and the issues around the cost of living. Let's bring in Bloomberg Correspondent-at-large for Europe, Alberto Nardelli, who's actually in the London studio this morning. Really pleased to have you with us. Look, I know that you are so knowledgeable about what's going on in Europe, but I want to think about it from the UK perspective just a little bit. I mean, Brexit sort of brings up years of trauma for you and for lots of other people. But if a future Labour government were to want to renegotiate a relationship with Europe, what do you think is actually possible? I mean, now that we've had the EU-wide elections, what do you think about that Labour-Europe relationship?
I think it's a very difficult and complicated question. If you look at it, say, from a big picture and renegotiating the entire relationship, I think both sides probably don't want that for different reasons. The European side, probably because they've spent years negotiating a deal and they have, like you were just saying, so many other issues to think about now, and having to do all of that all over again would bring back the trauma of years of successive British prime ministers wanting to negotiate different types of deals. And in the UK, I'm not sure Labour would want Brexit to become a central topic. They definitely don't want Brexit to be a key election issue now, and they probably don't want it to become a big topic in the first years of a Labour government, because it could immediately become a wedge issue with the Conservatives and others.
Yeah.
Having said that, what is more possible and likely is getting closer on specific issues. So, for example, you could have a deal on security and defence, which is something that Michel Barnier wanted to negotiate with previous British governments, and they didn't want that. The geopolitical and international situation has changed since then. So you could see a deal on security. There will probably be early on discussions on veterinary checks on agricultural goods, which could ease some of the friction around fruits and vegetables and meat products, which is one of the areas which have been most impacted by leaving the European Union.
Hey, Alberto, it's worth mentioning the Lib Dems manifesto's out today, and they're promising to seek to rejoin the single market, which I suppose marks a bit of a turning point, that we have got some more open conversations or centred conversations around Brexit in this election campaign. But I always can't help but thinking, when we talk about what the UK wants out of a better relationship with Europe, that it's very difficult to tell what's in it for the European Union if they would want to cozy up to a new British administration. How much does a change in government matter when it comes to change in that relationship? Just simply having a different face to deal with.
It does change a bit, because, for example, even with Sunak, they were able to reach certain arrangements that hadn't been possible with previous Conservative prime ministers. So it will change a little bit. The rhetoric is likely to change when it comes to having to deal with a Labour government, but the fundamental principles of the EU position, for example, you cannot have single market type benefits if you are not in the single market, those aren't going to change regardless of who becomes prime minister of which party is in charge. And so the EU will not want to have those conversations and will not want to renegotiate any of those points. So I think it will be more about specific issues and whether a Labour government would be open to discussing issues that the Conservative government didn't want to negotiate, and not because the European Union didn't want, say, a deal on security and defence, but it was something that the Conservative government did not want. I think that is where the EU will be more open.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, Brexit is not even a term that's really being discussed or used in the general election campaign. It's sort of disappeared from the lexicon because it's too toxic, right? But that doesn't mean that the trade friction idea has disappeared. And that, in fact, is the euphemism that you do see used, trade frictions or trade issues. I mean, in terms of what the EU election means, it is interesting. A number of people have made this point that actually the UK might be moving a bit more leftwards if we get a Labour government, versus what's happening in Europe, a sort of slight move to the right. I mean, compare and contrast, where are we in terms of the politics in Europe? Is that fair to say that Europe is moving, a little bit to the right?
On some issues, I think it's very difficult to have definitive narratives of an election that took place across 27 different countries. The results in the biggest countries, for obvious reasons, skew the overall result because France and Germany have more seats, and there's no doubt that in both countries there wasn't just a little shift, there was a massive shift to the right in both France and Germany. If you look at the results, say, in Nordic countries, for example, or in some Eastern European countries where they have a very strong grasp of recent history, in those countries the centre right and centre left did fairly well. Another trend, like you mentioned before, which is definitely what's happened, is a backlash on green policies, where voters feel that some of these policies have been forced upon them without much debate. But it's very hard to say this is what's happening across Europe. There is definitely a shift to the right, especially in the big and countries with most seats and countries that have most influence within the European Union, but the picture isn't uniform across all 27 countries. Brexit definitely was not an issue, though, in most of these countries because, like you were saying before, many of the parties that used to sit with Nigel Farage and others, they had positions to leave the European Union, having seen what's happened in the United Kingdom, have completely abandoned that policy position for now and have instead toughened their view on issues such as immigration and trying to change Europe's position from the inside.
Alberto, great to have you with us. Thanks very much from our correspondent at large, Alberto Nardelli, there joining us to talk about this. I'm going to put a date in the diary for something that we should watch out for when we talk about this, and that's the 18th of July, when the next meeting of the European political community is meant to take place. That's something that's supposed to, be the forum for the UK to make better friends with its friends in Europe. And by the time it comes around, we'll have had an election in the UK, we'll have had the French legislative elections, and we might even look close to having a new president of the European Commission as well. So perhaps that could be a big moment to think about. One to stick in the diary anyway.
There certainly is. But also I think that thought about those political parties and whether they're going to reshape Europe, or at least have a good go at trying to reshape Europe from within, I think is something that we're going to continue to watch. Alberto, lovely to have you on the programme this morning. And Stephen Carroll, good stuff in Brussels. I hope you managed to get, what is it? Frites
I'm off for some waffles.
Ketchup, waffles. Oh, there you go. And good stuff. You'll be back, of course, in London after your stint reporting out of Europe. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Woolcock. Our audio engineers were Sean Guastamacchia and Meredith Frank. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.